Hey guys, tonight we're stepping delicately into a velvet-draped sitting room, where lace gloves clutch spiny golden fruit like it's the Holy Grail, where porcelain teacups clink gently beside pyramids of peeled grapes, and where one's entire social worth might quite literally rest on a pineapple. Not even sliced, just there, on display. Yes, this is Victorian England, where pineapples were more than just tropical treats. They were statements, symbols, and status grenades lobbed across dinner tables. Imagine trying to earn admiration, not through wit or generosity, but by showing up with a fruit so rare, so expensive, so stupidly difficult to get that it made duchesses gasp and footmen tremble. That's where you are now. Welcome to Pineapple Society. You probably won't survive this. You'll blink too long, and someone else will have claimed the fruit's social aura. Or worse, someone will assume it's yours and ask about your family's plantations in Barbados, and then you'll just have to keep lying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little history club reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the threshold of a Victorian drawing room, all mahogany panels and a smell that's equal parts beeswax, perfume, and ambition. A woman glides past, corset tight enough to rearrange her organs, with something oddly shaped and quite spiky in her hands. You think maybe it's a sculpture? No, there's a sheen of condensation on the rind. That dear sleeper is a pineapple. Not eaten, not juiced, not touched by knife or tongue. Just proudly paraded like a clutch purse from heaven. Its presence in this room is a signal flare that says, someone in this house is wealthy, or at least wealthy adjacent. And they want you to know it. The pineapple didn't start off with this bizarre job description. It was born far from Victorian parlors in the warm, sticky embrace of South America and the Caribbean. Indigenous peoples had been growing it long. Before it was considered decorative, they ate it. Smart, right? But when European explorers stumbled upon this juicy delight in the 5th-10th century, their reaction was less yum and more whoa. Here was a fruit that looked like armor and tasted like paradise. Christopher Columbus, bless his colonizing heart, brought it back to Spain as one of his many ill-gotten souvenirs. From there, pineapples began their long, dramatic trek toward becoming high society's favorite spiny prop. Now, Victorian England did not grow pineapples naturally. The climate was more suited to damp poetry and tuberculosis, which meant that if you wanted one of these fruits on your table, you either had to import it at great cost and risk of spoilage or grow it yourself in a hothouse with heated beds and glass walls and an entire team of gardeners who probably had better things to do. These pineapple pits, as they were called, were expensive and temperamental. They were also the horticultural equivalent of driving a gold-plated steam engine through Hyde Park while waving a diamond-studded monocle. Imagine you're the lady of the house. Your husband deals in textiles or railways or something equally coal-stained, and your job is to host. The dinner party is your battlefield, and the centerpiece is your weapon. You don't need to win debates or flirt outrageously. You just need that pineapple to sit there, perfectly golden, ideally unblemished, catching the flicker of candlelight like a spiky little god. You'll say, oh, it came from my cousin's estate in Jamaica, or perhaps, we've had such success with our greenhouse this year. Neither is true. You rented it for the evening from a fruit broker who specializes in lending pineapples to desperate social climbers. Yes, you could rent a pineapple by the hour. Just like an opera cloak or a carriage. It would arrive in a velvet-lined box, and someone probably named Herald would be tasked with positioning it on the table like a Fabergé egg. Everyone would pretend it was yours. You'd get nods, maybe even a second invitation from Lady, What's her name who previously looked through you like you were just another doily? And no one, absolutely no one, would ask to taste it. That would be barbaric. Pineapples weren't for eating. They were for implying things, like colonial ties, like generational wealth, like, I can afford to let a fruit rot in my foyer because I have nothing better to do. This is your world now. The air smells of roasted lamb, beeswax, and a faint mustiness from the rented pineapple, which is already beginning to turn. You hope no one gets close enough to smell it. A footman discreetly dabs it with a napkin to remove the wet sheen. You sip your sherry and pretend not to notice. The woman across the table is giving you the look. The one that says, "Did she really get that from her own hothouse?" You smile, sip again, and say, "We've had such luck with the weather this year." She nods, defeated. The fruit wins again. Of course, historians still argue whether the pineapple's role in Victorian social posturing was truly as widespread as the anecdotes suggest, or whether this was mostly a London phenomenon, boosted by gossip and the proliferation of household guides that exaggerated trends for clickser readers. What's agreed upon is that for a time, the pineapple existed in a strange liminal space between produce and power symbol. It wasn't just a fruit. It was a filtered selfie before selfies existed. And there you are, standing in the doorway of a world where food became fashion, where nature was bent and scorched and forced to bloom in cold climates just to prove a point. A world where the pineapple didn't feed people, it fed their egos. So you linger, eyes tracing the ridges of the fruit. It doesn't blink. It doesn't wilt. It just sits there, golden, smug, and utterly uneaten. You find yourself slipping further into the strange Gilded Age, where fruit carried reputations and sugar was still a bit scandalous. The pineapple, your uncut, unripened, and wildly expensive co-host, didn't get to that centerpiece by accident. Its journey was epic, like a fruit version of Odysseus in petticoats. Imagine being plucked under the sun-drenched canopy of a Caribbean plantation, surrounded by buzzing insects and the sweet, almost fermented scent of tropical air. You don't just pop a pineapple in your knapsack and head for London. No, first, it had to survive being hacked from the plant at just the right ripeness. Too soon, and it'd taste like tart regret. Too late, and you'd have to apologize to every carriage passenger between here and Liverpool. Once harvested, the pineapple was carefully packed, often cushioned like precious cargo with straw, wrapped in muslin, and cradled in crates built more for Fabergé eggs than fruit. The trip was no less treacherous than the voyage of any 19th century fortune seeker. Sea travel was not a spa cruise. It was weeks of rolling waves, rats, damp wood, and the constant threat of rot. A pineapple arriving in one piece was a minor miracle. It was said that for every 50 pineapples picked, maybe one would make it to Britain in a condition worth showing off. If you were very lucky, the crown would be intact, the skin unbruised, and the sugar content just high enough to hint at paradise without actually sharing it. That's what made it special. Scarcity plus fragility equals luxury. You're drifting on a cargo ship now, in your imagination surrounded by barrels, crates, and the whispering complaints of sailors who think it's absolutely bonkers to risk lives and limbs for fruit. In some of the ledgers from the period, pineapples were valued higher than silverware or imported textiles. In one legendary tale, a pineapple destined for a London banquet was given its own guarded carriage. The fruit rode in solitary splendor while its handlers slept on hay in the barn. There are also whispers, though historians still argue the validity of pineapples being carried under armed guard through rough neighborhoods of London, lest some fruit-hungry ruffian stage a robbery. Think of it, a pineapple heist carried out like a jewel theft. It's hard not to laugh gently at the absurdity. Once in London, pineapples went straight into the hands of fruit brokers, men who lived lives of quiet desperation, arranging high-stakes produce deals. They knew which society ladies were desperate enough to pay for a display piece, and which gentleman would throw coin after coin at a fruit just to avoid being upstaged. The brokers kept ledgers with notes like Mrs. L, twice last season, prefers symmetrical crowns, or Lord B, nervous about rot, prefers waxed bases. There were entire economies built on these details. The market stalls of Covent Garden, once filled with the scent of apples and fresh herbs, began to develop a secondary industry in imported glamour fruit. The pineapple wasn't alone there. Were also bananas, mangoes, even the occasional guava, but none of them matched the pineapple's cachet. It was the perfect storm of appearance, rarity, and a vaguely colonial aftertaste that Victorians just couldn't resist. You walk down a cobbled street now, passing stalls shouting about melons and cherries, and there under glass with its own spotlight is a pineapple. It's propped up like a holy relic. Children press their noses against the display. A young woman clutches her sketchbook, attempting to draw it before it's sold or taken away. Somewhere behind the counter, a fruit broker leans against a ledger, adjusting his cuffs, waiting for a lady with enough desperation in her eyes and coin in her purse to make the rental worth it. And yes, there were rentals, because nobody in their right mind actually bought pineapples to eat them unless they were truly, unthinkably rich or ready to make a statement so loud it'd echo through drawing rooms for months. Renting a pineapple cost less, but still wasn't cheap. You paid for the illusion. You paid to be believed. That fruit would sit on your table for a few hours, look fantastic in the candlelight, maybe get a few admirers sighing, and then it would be returned, perhaps a little softer, a little riper, but still majestic enough for someone else's evening. Some women, determined to own the illusion more permanently, commissioned wax pineapples. These were handcrafted marvels sculpted by artisans who had to make each prickle look realistic enough to fool guests at candlelit dinners. They'd add sheen, slight imperfections, and occasionally scent, dabbing bits of pineapple juice at the base just to sell the ruse. These fakes became family heirlooms. They'd appear at wedding feasts, holiday tables, christenings. You could almost see the pride in a woman's eyes as she nodded to her wax pineapple, as if to say, yes, we have one. And no, you can't smell the glue from here. Of course, there were rules. The pineapple could not be handled casually. Guests were expected to admire it from a distance. Children were absolutely forbidden to touch it. Servants were instructed to clean around it, not over it. And should anyone be gauche enough to ask whether it was real, well, that person would not be invited again. It was impolite to expose illusion, especially when illusion was doing all the heavy lifting. In some homes, the same pineapple was rented week after week, displayed on slightly different china, with slightly different lighting, just to suggest seasonal bounty. It became part of the visual language of aspiration. And over time, it started to shift. Just as handbags, cars, or watches would later take the role, the pineapple was a form of silent social messaging. Owning it said, I have taste. I have access. I belong. The strange thing is, most of the Victorians displaying these fruits had never tasted one. Not really. Maybe a slice at a wedding in 1842. Maybe a candy bit tucked into a tart at a cousin's engagement. But the idea of taking a knife to one, of reducing its power by actually eating it, felt like tearing pages from a holy book to start a fire. It would have been unthinkable. Besides, pineapples didn't always arrive in edible condition. Many were overripe, bruised, or dry inside. But that didn't matter. By the time they got to the drawing room, they'd already served their purpose. Still, historians debate whether the pineapple obsession was ever truly as widespread as society magazines claimed. Some argue that it was mostly a London affectation limited to the wealthiest households and the most cutthroat hostesses. Others suggest that the symbolism trickled down faster than expected, that middle-class families with a few extra coins did indeed scramble for their shot at fruit-fueled status. There's evidence of pineapples appearing in provincial town halls, wedding portraits, even taxidermy displays. One woman reportedly had a pineapple embroidered onto her corset, a detail few would ever see, but which she claimed made her stand taller at events. So here you are, wandering through a market of ambition and waxy deception, trailing the scent of imported sugar and social anxiety. Somewhere, a young woman counts her coins, wondering if she can afford 2 hours of borrowed glory. Somewhere else, a broker writes another name into his little black book. And on a pedestal near a window, basking in candlelight and silent awe, a pineapple stands like a monarch, regal, slightly sticky, totally untouchable. Let's drift now to one of those candlelit parlors, warmed by fireplace and fragile egos, where your pineapple, yes, yours for the evening, sits in the place of honor atop a lace doily, nestled among cut glass vases and too many forks. It is not to be eaten. It is not even to be approached. It is, instead, to be admired with reverence. Because behind that spiky rind lies not juice or fiber, but status. You're seated near the head of the table, close enough to hear Lady Ashworth whisper to her cousin, "I do wonder how she affords it." You pretend not to hear, and you smile with a practiced grace. What she doesn't know is that the pineapple's been rented, same as the footman who just refilled her wine. But what matters is perception, and this fruit is your armor tonight. In Victorian society, appearances were not just everything, they were the whole menu. And pineapples were the rarest of appetizers, seen but not served. That's the paradox you live with. You're surrounded by food, yet the most prestigious item on display is the one nobody can touch. It's theater, really, and you? You're in the starring role, but what did it cost to get here? If you were determined to actually own a pineapple, in this era, not rent, not borrow, but possess, you'd be forking over the equivalent of several £100s. One record from the 1840s notes a pineapple sold for nearly £80 in today's value. That's half a year's salary for a housemaid, a whole wardrobe for a governess, enough to repair a leaking roof or buy several sets of morning attire, all for one fruit. And still, it was considered a bargain, but only if you could keep it from spoiling. Victorians knew all too well that the pineapple began dying the moment it left the stem. Time was never on your side. The longer you owned it, the more precarious its shine became. A single bruise could sabotage your whole dinner narrative. Guests would whisper, eyes would linger on the discolored patch. "Such a pity," they'd murmur. "Perhaps her gardener isn't what he used to be." So naturally, women developed elaborate routines to care for their pineapples, brushing them lightly with oil to enhance the sheen, rotating them under sunlight to balance fading, even keeping them chilled in pantries filled with ice cut in winter and stored in underground blocks. All this so a fruit could survive long enough to sit untouched. For 2 hours while people pretended not to be looking, pineapples weren't just dinner decor. They made appearances at balls, tea parties, and afternoon salons. One story half laughed and half believed tells of a woman who brought her pineapple to church, carried like a baby, wrapped in linen to let others glimpse her fortune without a single word spoken. The priest, reportedly, did not object. Perhaps he too had pineapple envy, but it wasn't just about the object. It was about the whisper trail it created. If you brought a pineapple to a function, you didn't need to boast. The fruit boasted for you. It told stories you never had to say aloud, that your husband had contacts in Jamaica, that your greenhouse had thrived in an otherwise terrible season, that you were, in short, better prepared for the struggles of wealth than the woman with only roses in her parlor. Etiquette books of the era began to comment on the pineapple phenomenon, with some warning that excessive fruit display bordered on vulgar. "Better to host with grace than to fruit with desperation," wrote one etiquette columnist in 1862. Another cautioned that pineapples should be presented only in their proper place and with modest restraint. Still, these same guides offered tips on selecting the perfect specimen, positioning it at the center of a table, and draping it in delicate linens to prevent fly bites. It was performative, of course. It always had been. But the performance mattered. In a society where women's voices were limited and their ambitions often boxed into domestic arenas, fruit could speak in their place. And the pineapple, exotic, dangerous, royal-looking, spoke the loudest. Now picture this. You're hosting your first major dinner party. You've rented the silver, borrowed your aunt's chandelier, and spent the last of your glove money on a pineapple. It arrives in a wooden crate lined with soft straw. You lift it out like a newborn. It's perfect. Each prickle sharp and proud, its color rich gold fading into mossy green. For one wild moment, you consider cutting it open. Just one slice. Surely no one would notice? But then you remember the stakes, the looks, the whispers, the cost. So instead, you place it gently on the porcelain plate, fluff the napkin underneath, and step back. It's beautiful. It's tragic. It's yours. But not for long. It would surprise no one to learn that many pineapples, after serving their social purpose, were discarded rather than eaten. They'd been on display too long, touched too many times, softened at the core. Some were turned into jam, others soaked in rum, but most were simply tossed. It was, as the newspapers didn't say, the quiet death of ambition, and yet the cycle continued. Each season brought new pineapples, new dinners, new performances. The fruit, after all, was a renewable illusion. Among the working class, pineapples became symbols of aspiration, appearing in prints, on crockery, even in pub signs. A tavern might hang a wooden pineapple up front to attract patrons, promising tropical dreams in the form of warm ale and boiled beef. Children in London's East End were known to play with hollowed pineapple rinds, scavenged from market trash, pretending they too hosted royal dinners. Meanwhile, writers of the day began slipping pineapple metaphors into novels and poems. One popular serial described a heroine as ripe as a Calcutta pineapple, yet twice as sharp to the touch. Whatever that meant, readers knew it was a compliment. Still, historians debate just how symbolic the fruit truly became outside urban centers. Was it truly aspirational, or just a passing fad among a narrow social band? Was the pineapple obsession a uniquely British affair, or part of a broader European trend? Some evidence suggests that French aristocrats briefly flirted with the pineapple craze, but largely dismissed it as aesthetic vulgarite. In Russia, meanwhile, pineapples were reportedly used as both a table centerpiece and, bizarrely, a remedy for melancholia. In any case, Britain clung hardest and longest to the pineapple dream. Perhaps because, in a society addicted to the quiet language of props and propriety, nothing else looked quite so confidently ridiculous. As you sit back now, letting the firelight flicker over your rented fruit, you understand something crucial. This pineapple, glorious, golden, and increasingly squishy, is not just decoration. It is armor. It shields you from questions about your lineage, your dowry, your late uncle's debt. It tells the room that you belong, even if your dress is last season and your pearls are glass. In a world obsessed with symbols, this one speaks volumes. And tonight, it speaks for you. You've left the dinner party behind now, or rather, you've floated sideways into its more theatrical twin, the parlor, where guests lounge post-feast among velvet cushions and polished sideboards, and where the pineapple, having served as centerpiece and conversation starter, now lounges too on a silver tray in the corner like a smug little celebrity who knows it just dominated the social circuit. This is where the real game begins, though. In the hush of candlelight, over cups of weak tea and brittle biscuits, where glances sharpen and small talk wears lace gloves dipped in vinegar. And you sit quietly, your pineapple still radiating enough status to warm the room, even as it begins its slow march toward overripe. But more than just a fruit now. It's a tool, a shield, A secret weapon in the chess game of Victorian flirtation. Because here's the delicious twist. In this odd little slice of history, pineapples weren't just for show, they were for courtship. Imagine, you're a young woman of not quite scandalous marriageable age, positioned delicately between your mother's ambition and your own cautious hope. You don't speak first. You never initiate. But you know, instinctively, that the fruit on the tray is doing some of your talking for you. Because a pineapple, in this world, carries with it implications. Not just wealth, but connection. Not just beauty, but adventure. Rumors swirl about what it means to pineapple properly. Some say if a lady places a pineapple closer to her teacup, it implies openness to conversation. Further away, a desire for solitude. Others whisper about the third slice rule, where cutting just 1, 2, or 3 slices during a party meant different stages of flirtatious encouragement. It's likely nonsense, but in an age where women weren't allowed to say, "I like you," any gesture, no matter how absurd, could be read for meaning. And then there's the matter of presentation. How the fruit is placed on the tray. How it's lit. Whether it's flanked by roses or lavender. You once heard of a woman who nestled hers in a cradle of white lily, claiming it symbolized tropical purity. She was engaged by the end of the season. Coincidence? Possibly, but the message was clear. If you could style your pineapple, you could style your prospects. Some ladies even commissioned miniature pineapple brooches carved from bone or painted porcelain to wear subtly on their lapels. A kind of visual pun. Yes, I am the fruit, they seem to say. And no, you may not taste. Men, of course, were not blind to the fruit's magnetic pull. Some adopted pineapples as personal brands. One particularly theatrical gentleman, a baronet with a penchant for scarves, became known for arriving at events with a pineapple under one arm, as if it were a bouquet or a small dog. It became his calling card. Ah yes, Lord Anson and his fruit. Women rolled their eyes, but they remembered him. Another suitor once tried to impress a family by sending a crate of pineapples as a courting gift. Unfortunately, most were spoiled by the time they arrived, and the family dog got into one and fell violently ill. The engagement was called off shortly after. Still, the symbol endured. Artists began slipping pineapples into courtship paintings, often nestled innocently near the background like a fruity cupid. Satirical cartoons of the time mocked the phenomenon. One particularly famous etching shows a young woman swooning over a pineapple while an equally golden-haired suitor stands unnoticed beside her, holding a rose. The caption reads, "She prefers her suitors spiked." Subtlety was never satire's strength. There were real consequences, though, to fruit-based romance. One anonymous diary entry from 1853 tells of a young woman who was shunned after being caught privately slicing her pineapple in the company of a young man. The implication, though no one said it aloud, was that she had shared too much. Too soon, her family left London for the season. Her reputation never quite recovered. Pineapples, like words, had power. And like all powerful things, they had to be used with care. Historians still argue whether the whole pineapple flirtation code was ever codified, or whether it was more folklore than fact, a kind of urban legend within the parlor set. But personal. Letters and etiquette guides of the time do reference fruit forwardness and the implication of slicing, with a delicacy that suggests some unspoken understanding existed. It makes sense. When everything else in a woman's life was dictated by others, her schedule, her clothing, even her posture, why not sneak a little autonomy through the placement of a fruit? Let's not forget, too, the pineapple's gendered symbolism. Unlike other fruit, which was soft, round, and often linked to domesticity, the pineapple was spiky, armored, slightly absurd. It didn't fit cleanly into the era's notions of femininity, and yet, that's what made it so potent. A woman with a pineapple was making a statement, conscious or not. She wasn't just decorative, she had edge. And potential. And just enough colonial exoticism to intrigue without scandalizing. No one really said this aloud. It wasn't polite. But it was understood. You recline now on a chaise in the corner of your mind's Victorian parlor, the gentle murmur of conversation floating by like steam from a kettle. The pineapple is beside you, not quite fragrant, not yet spoiled. It sits heavy with meaning. Perhaps someone glances at you. Perhaps not. The point is, they could. The performance is ongoing, and the fruit is doing most of the acting. As the evening wears on, the pineapple begins to soften. You pretend not to notice. A small shadow appears on one side, nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest that tomorrow it may not be usable. You're used to this. You've learned to return it before the rot sets in. Timing is everything. You catch the eye of the footman and give a tiny nod. He'll pack it away tonight. Someone else will rent it tomorrow. And the game will begin again. You leave the parlor now, but not the fruit. Because as you slip into your dreams or someone else's memory, the pineapple is still with you, reincarnated not as centerpiece or flirtation tool, but as a kind of visual currency. You're in. Another home now, another Victorian sitting room. This one smaller, warmer, with mismatched chairs and wallpaper that's trying very hard to stay attached. It smells like furniture polish and boiled cabbage. And here too, there's a pineapple. But not a real one. Not even a good fake. This one is painted, somewhat clumsily, on the wallpaper border near the ceiling, just a hint of it, repeating every 2 feet like a shy but persistent brand logo. That's what the pineapple has become in this chapter, decorative shorthand for "we're trying." Because even for those who couldn't afford the real thing or its wax sibling, the fruit's power lingered. If you couldn't display it, you could still reference it. The symbolism remained intact, even if the object itself never entered your home. This was the age of visual cues. If the aristocracy had their rented pineapples, the middle class had printed ones. They turned up everywhere. On ceramics, in embroidery, etched onto silver cutlery, carved into the tops of bedposts, even stitched into the collars of baby gowns. You once saw a woman at a public garden party wearing a modest brooch shaped like a pineapple gold-toned. Clearly costume, probably from a market stall, but she wore it like a duchess. And people noticed, because it still meant something. It was still a wink to the world. I may not host grand dinners, but I know what luxury looks like. In this way, the pineapple was democratized. It trickled down like syrup on toast. It became a dream you could wear, a motif you could afford, a tiny rebellion against the rigid social rules that otherwise told you where you belonged. Covent Garden, which had once been the heartbeat of the pineapple trade, evolved to meet this shift. Where once fruit brokers had whispered deals over crates of ripening gold, now shopkeepers sold pineapple-shaped trinkets, hatpins, sewing boxes, and even paperweights. Children begged for pineapple-shaped sweets, which rarely tasted anything like the real thing, but had the right pattern and the vaguely tropical flavor achieved mostly through chemistry and prayer. Some vendors began selling pineapple powder, promising to transform ordinary puddings into aristocratic fare. It was mostly sugar and artificial flavoring, but it did the job. The middle class was eager for these illusions. Real pineapples were still out of reach, but symbols? Symbols were for everyone. That shift didn't go unnoticed. The aristocracy, always allergic to being copied, began to retreat from the pineapple's orbit. Where once they displayed the fruit proudly, they now moved toward more rarefied tastes: French porcelain, Italian marbles, exotic pets. But the pineapple had already cemented itself. It was in the architecture now, literally. Gateposts shaped like pineapples began to appear on estates. It became common for inns to be named the Pineapple Arms or the Golden Fruit. You'd see carved pineapples at the tops of staircases, above doorways, in fountain statuary. Architects embraced the motif for its symmetry and symbolism, hospitality, abundance, tropical mystique. Historians still argue whether this shift in symbolism was deliberate or accidental, but the result was the same. The pineapple moved from edible rarity to cultural mainstay. It was no longer just a fruit, it was a design choice, and a surprisingly loud one. You imagine yourself now walking into a Victorian guest house where the wallpaper features pineapples and the napkin rings match. You're handed a pineapple-shaped key fob. The silverware has pineapple engravings. You smile politely and wonder if the owner has ever tasted the real thing. Probably not. But that's not the point. It's about creating a feeling, a fantasy, that you are somewhere lavish, sunny, and far from the soot-stained streets of London. That's the pineapple's final magic trick. It makes you forget that you're in a drafty room where the only heat comes from a sputtering fireplace and a suspiciously noisy tea kettle. One fringe detail that gets lost in the official histories. There were entire industries built around pineapple-themed entertainment. Puppet theaters staged little plays in which fruits spoke to one another about manners and destiny. Children's books featured pineapples as characters, sometimes wise, sometimes vain, always gilded. One particularly strange moral tale from 1878 told the story of a humble apple who envied a pineapple's popularity, only to discover that the pineapple had no friends and died alone in a hothouse. The message was something about staying true to one's roots, but most readers remembered it for the line, "He wore his crown high, but never shared a slice." It became a running joke in some circles. There were pineapple songs too. Music. Hall ditties with lyrics like, "Oh Miss Penelope, with your sweet golden fruit, I'd rent thee a dozen if you'd lend me your boot." Not exactly Shakespeare, but catchy and effective. The pineapple became part of pop culture before pop culture was even a thing. There were even fashion parodies. One satirical magazine published a guide on how to dress like a fruit, complete with illustrations of bonnets shaped like pineapples and corsets dyed to match their green tops. Some women actually tried it. The results were mixed. Still, beneath all the laughter and embroidery and wax replicas, the pineapple retained a kind of quiet dignity. Even as it was commodified, it was never entirely mocked. There was always a lingering trace of awe, a memory of its power. People remembered the days when it arrived under velvet cloth, guarded like a jewel, admired like a monarch. And even if they'd never seen one up close, they'd heard the stories. That's what mattered. The story was stronger than the fruit itself, more lasting than the flavor. That's what pineapples became in Victorian life. Not food, but folklore. And you, still tucked within this story, recognize the genius of it. A fruit so impractical, so perishable, so bizarre in shape, managed to infiltrate every corner of culture, not because of what it was, but because of what people needed it to be. You're wandering now through a gallery of gazes, not portraits. Exactly, but social scenes frozen in embroidered tapestries and dainty tea sets. All around you, pineapples. Not whole ones anymore, but hints. A corner of wallpaper curling back to reveal the outline of its spiny crown. A teacup with a barely visible golden rind at the lip. Even the sugar bowl, shaped like a squat little globe, bears the faint geometric pattern of pineapple skin, as if someone, somewhere whispered, "Let no surface go unpineappled." You can feel it, can't you? The way it lingers. Not just as a fruit, not just a symbol, but as etiquette crystallized into aesthetic form. Because this was the Victorian ideal, to be so civil, so precise, so socially attuned that even your fruit followed rules. And tonight, you get to follow them too. This is where we slow our pace just slightly, because etiquette through codified 19th century social performance requires a different kind of attention. You don't just walk into a room and show your pineapple. No, there's a whole dance involved. Placement mattered. Positioning a pineapple at the head of a table implied that the host was confident in their lineage. Positioning it in the center, flanked by candles, indicated a more democratic, but still prestige-focused intent. But placing it near the edge of a sideboard? That was dangerous. It hinted at modesty or worse, unfamiliarity with the rules. And in a society where the wrong fork could end your marriage prospects, the wrong pineapple location was no small detail. You sit beside one now, watching as a maid gently polishes its skin with a damp cloth. She does it slowly, methodically, like she's tending to a sacred relic. The room is quiet, but the tension is thick. Every dinner guest will pass. This fruit will nod to it, will allow their gaze to linger just long enough to be polite, but not so long that it implies hunger. That's the other rule. You must never act like you want to eat the pineapple. That would be crude, a betrayal of its ornamental destiny. A pineapple wasn't there for sustenance. It was there for story. To remind everyone at the table that this home was connected to trade, to heat, to gardeners who knew how to coddle tropical growth in British fog. There's a booklet on the side table now, part of a growing genre of hostess guides. It offers specific advice on fruit-centered entertaining. Page 47. If your pineapple appears bruised on arrival, place a folded linen under it and angle the blemish toward the wall. Pineapple rot is unsightly and may distract from the evenings. Conversation. Page 63. Guests may admire but should never question the origin of the fruit. Doing so implies suspicion of the hostess's honesty. It's both ridiculous and painfully serious. These guides sold like hotcakes. Women studied them like scriptures. Because in a world where very few things were under their control, pineapple, etiquette was a strange little realm where they could claim mastery. You overhear a snippet of conversation. Now two ladies near the fireplace, cups of tea balanced precariously on saucers. I hear the Witherspoons got theirs from Bath. One says, with the kind of tone usually reserved for rumors about illegitimate children. The other sips slowly and replies, "Yes, but I doubt they grew it. His greenhouse is barely big enough for tulips." They share a knowing look, and you realize this isn't just gossip. This is combat. Victorian society was a battlefield of glances and veiled remarks, and the pineapple was both sword and shield. There were even pineapple-specific insults. Pithy, meaning someone who looked glamorous but lacked substance. Half-ripe, implying a woman who aspired to status without the pedigree to support it. Frondbent, used for pineapples whose crowns had wilted in transit, but also whispered about women whose reputations had taken a tumble. It sounds absurd now, like fruit-themed stand-up, but in its time, these coded slurs had real bite. Historians still argue how widespread this hyper-formalized pineapple etiquette really was. Some claim it was exaggerated by period novels and magazines looking for amusing content. Others point to letters and surviving hostess manuals as evidence that these rules were deeply entrenched, particularly among social climbers who feared making any misstep that might unmask their origins. There's truth to both sides. The rigid rules weren't universal, but their threat hovered everywhere. Just knowing about them meant you were in. The fruit also had a role in mourning customs, oddly enough. After the death of a prominent family member, some households would remove the pineapple from display entirely for the duration of mourning. Others would keep it on the table, but cover it in a black veil. Yes, a tiny mourning veil for a fruit. One etiquette journal even offered pre-written excuses to print on mourning cards, such as, "We regret that our household's fruit display will be suspended during this somber season." To the modern ear, it sounds like high farce. But to the Victorians, this was an act of social self-preservation. Grief had a dress code. So did your sideboard. You imagine now a parlor with dark curtains drawn, mirrors draped, and a single pineapple, sitting in quiet dignity beneath a swatch of black lace. It's tragic, yes, but also a little ridiculous. That's the tension Victorian etiquette often lived in, between sincerity and satire, ritual and farce. And the pineapple sat right at the center of it. A fruit that didn't know it had become a prop. A fruit whose real flavor was barely remembered, because no one ever dared slice it open. Tonight, you notice the fruit is a little darker than before. Its skin has dulled slightly. The fronds droop. The maid doesn't mention it, but you see her tuck an extra cloth under the base, adjusting the angle so the decay isn't visible from the door. It's only a matter of time now before the pineapple must be removed, not eaten, not used, simply rotated out. Replaced by another. This too was part of etiquette. When to retire your fruit, when to surrender the illusion. The timing had to be perfect. Too early and you seemed paranoid. Too late and you risked public embarrassment. You sit still, letting this absurdity wash over you like warm bath water. The rules were never really about pineapples. They were about power, about control, about performing your place in a world built on appearances. And somehow, through layers of wax, silver trays, etiquette books, and whispered commentary, the pineapple became not just a fruit, but a performance in itself. Now as the night deepens around you and the fire in the imagined parlor sinks into a soft, ember-glow haze, your thoughts slip toward the absurdly delicate art of flirtation in a society that treated direct emotion like a public health risk. Welcome to the subtle seductions of pineapple courtship, an entire genre of genteel maneuvering so faintly coded it makes modern texting games look like skywriting. Here, in this heavily perfumed parlor filled with laughter, fan flicks, and too much furniture, women wield pineapples not just as social armor, but as flirtation devices, using them the way modern influencers use lighting, to be seen, but with plausible deniability. Picture it now, you, seated on a low chaise near the fruit-laden sideboard, making polite conversation with a well-coiffed young gentleman, whose cravat has clearly taken longer to tie than your entire outfit. You smile. He gestures at the pineapple, says something clever like exquisite skin, almost like yours, and you let your fan flutter just slightly. It's the 1850s version of a DM slide, but no one watching could ever prove it. Pineapples, after all, were conversation magnets. If you had one at a party, people came to you. If you displayed it during an afternoon salon, it became a natural focal point, especially for guests bored of discussing chimney taxes or Cousin Millie's gout. A young woman could lean near it, adjust its napkin accidentally, or compare its scent to some made-up tropical memory. Young men, eager for a topic that didn't involve shipping forecasts or parliamentary scandals, would take the bait. "Have you ever tasted one?" he'd ask. "Only once," you'd reply, "at my uncle's wedding. It was overripe." Cue laughter, the faintest mutual acknowledgement, and a shared social secret wrapped in tropical thorns. Some women took it further. There are records, real or romanticized, of pineapples being used in gifting rituals. A suitor might present a pineapple as a token of admiration, which sounds harmless until you realize the value of such a gift, bordered on engagement-level significance. Accepting it was a statement. Refusing it politely, of course, meant you weren't interested, or you didn't wish to owe a debt you couldn't repay. The more daring ladies of London's drawing rooms would send pineapples anonymously, sparking weeks of whispered speculation. Who sent it? Did she know? Was it intended for her or for her mother? The pineapple was a loaded gift, a slow-burning message that carried its own flavor of gossip, layered in syrupy subtext. One particularly bold socialite, Lady Marguerite Penfeather, was known for her pineapple plays. At each of her infamous summer parties, she'd commission a sculptor to carve a massive wax pineapple, place it atop a revolvine pedestal, and assign it a cryptic name: anticipation, regret, possibility. Guests were invited to write notes and leave them near the sculpture, predicting what the fruit symbolized that year. She never revealed the answer. It was Victorian fortune-telling with a fruity twist. Men who attempted to impress her were often invited to guess what the pineapple meant, which led to increasingly absurd metaphors and at least one failed proposal. She never married, but she did own the largest collection of pineapple-shaped ink pots in Hampshire. And then there were the coded compliments. "You must be used to such exotic company," whispered over punch, or "that crown suits you," murmured while she adjusted the fruit's angle on the mantel. The lines weren't just clever, they were calibrated to test the waters. Victorian courtship didn't allow for declarations. It barely tolerated suggestions. So pineapples became linguistic loopholes. A way to say, "I see you," without saying anything dangerous enough to need explaining later. Historians still debate how intentional this was. Some suggest the pineapple's flirtation role has been exaggerated by modern reinterpretations hungry for metaphors. Others argue that because everything in Victorian society was layered with meaning, flowers, gloves, seating order, it stands to reason that pineapples got folded into the romantic economy, especially when their cost and novelty already elevated them to emotional objects. Regardless of intent, the pineapple functioned as a flirtation accelerant. It gave people something safe to talk about, something charged with just enough innuendo to keep things interesting, but never so overt that a chaperone would object. And yet, as with all things in this tightly wound society, flirtation through fruit had its dangers. There's the case of Clara Wentworth, a governess who received a pineapple anonymously and, assuming it was a gift from a gentleman she'd been gently eyeing all season, responded with a note and a dried corsage. The pineapple, it turned out, was intended for her employer, a fact revealed in the most painful of drawing-room misunderstandings. Clara was dismissed within the week. Her romantic hopes rotted faster than the pineapple ever could. Still, there were wins. Matches made through subtle fruit-based flirtation. Unions sparked by shared pineapple commentary. These are the stories that passed from one salon to the next, embroidered by each retelling. Did you hear? They bonded over a pineapple arrangement. He complimented her fruit placement, and now they're engaged. It all sounds ridiculous now, sure. But when you couldn't speak your heart plainly, when even touching someone's sleeve sent ripples through the room, you used what you had. Fans, flowers, and sometimes fruit. Now, picture this. A summer lawn party. Grass a bit too damp from last night's rain. Ladies in pale gloves sipping lemonade. In the center of a long table draped in embroidered linen, a pineapple rests atop a crystal cake stand. Around it, couples drift like slow clouds, casting glances, trading compliments, standing just close enough to feel the warmth of shared amusement. Someone mentions its ripeness. Another remarks on the craftsmanship of the bowl. You, standing nearby, feel a familiar gaze. A gentleman nods toward the pineapple, then toward you. No words needed. The message is clear. I notice you. I respect your fruit choices. Shall we walk? You take his arm. The pineapple stays behind. But it did its job. Let's take a walk now, shall we? You slip from the perfumed parlors and polite murmurs into the stone-paved morning clatter of Covent Garden. It's early, but not quiet. The city wakes noisily. The clop of hooves, the creak of cartwheels, the sharp cry of a vendor announcing bruised apples, 4 a penny. You're here for something less ordinary, though. Something gilded and mysterious, even in daylight. You wander past stalls piled with cabbages and radishes and bruised cherries, your feet crunching over a scatter of onion skins and straw, until you spot it there, under a frayed red awning. Nestled in a velvet-draped crate behind glass is your fruit of the hour, a pineapple. It's not fresh, not perfect, maybe not even entirely real. But the crowd that's formed around it doesn't seem to care. They're leaning in, peering at it the way museum-goers might study a fossil. One child asks if it's gold. Another tries to touch it, only to be swatted back with a practiced hand. You're witnessing the theater of aspiration in action. This isn't a market stall, it's a stage, and the pineapple is the star. Man running the stall wears a coat far too elegant for his job. He's got waxed mustaches and a faint Caribbean accent that's probably fake, but helps the fantasy along. He gestures with a flourish. "Ladies and gentlemen," he says, imported. From St. Kitts, carried on the sea air itself, a marvel of nature, a wonder of horticulture. Who among you will grace your Sunday table with this jewel of the tropics? Nobody answers, but the silence is part awe, part negotiation. Everyone wants to touch the dream, but few want to pay for it. That's where the real heart of the pineapple. Broker comes in, not just in selling the fruit, but in selling the story. You stay and watch as a woman steps forward, clutching a worn purse. She doesn't ask to buy the pineapple. She knows better. Instead, she leans in close and murmurs something you can't hear. The broker nods solemnly, opens a ledger, writes down her name. She's booked it, for an afternoon. She'll pick it up at 3, return it by 7. He'll polish it, prep it, even include a small placard claiming it was grown on her family's estate. No one will know. Her guests will arrive, see the pineapple, and judge accordingly. And that, dear listener, is the magic of Covent Garden, renting. Pineapples wasn't exactly legal or illegal. It sat in that peculiar Victorian gray area reserved for questionable fashion and ghost photography. The fruit brokers weren't shopkeepers in the traditional sense. They were dream merchants, selling illusions to anyone who could afford the price, often in installments. Some had even begun to offer pineapple packages, where for an added fee, you could receive a few matching wax bananas or a small bowl of imitation dates, all arranged to suggest a lifestyle you absolutely did not possess. These displays were sometimes photographed and included in albums. The pineapple year, one woman labeled hers, with a sepia image of her parlor and the crowned fruit in pride of place, lit like a saint. But Covent Garden wasn't all velvet crates and silent longing. It was also chaos. Loud, smelly, crowded, and full of drama. The pineapple trade attracted gossip like jam attracts bees. Whispers flew about which brothel had a standing pineapple rental. Rumors circulated of counterfeit fruit-painted melons, passed off to unsuspecting renters. One story tells of a woman who fainted dead away upon realizing the pineapple at her luncheon was hollow. Her reputation never recovered. And of course, there were the thefts. Petty, ridiculous fruit-based crimes that shook certain corners of society with more intensity than any murder trial ever could. Historians love to debate these stories, unsure whether they're real or Victorian urban legends. The case of the crate-switching widow. The Great Pineapple Swap of '71. They read like tabloid headlines, and maybe they were. But what's certain is this: the market around pineapples wasn't just economic. It was emotional. It fed something deeper than hunger. A need to be seen, to be part of a world where things were golden, rare, and just out of reach. And for a few hours, if you knew where to go, you could hold it in your hands. You take one last loop through the market, dodging a barrow of turnips, pausing by a man selling pineapple perfume that smells suspiciously like burnt sugar and vinegar. Children shout, a goat bleats, and somewhere in the fray, another deal is struck. A woman leaves with a carefully wrapped pineapple, holding it like a newborn. You know where she's headed. Home, guests, candles, admiration, the illusion ready to begin again. There's something sad and sweet about it, isn't there? This constant yearning toward a fruit that nobody eats. That isn't meant to be eaten. That functions more like a mask than a meal. But such was life in Victorian London, especially for the ones stuck in between, the not quite rich, the almost important. The women who knew how to decorate a dream so well it passed for reality. As you leave the market, the noise fades behind you, replaced by the hush of late afternoon. You glance back once, and there it is again, that pineapple in the window. Still drawing eyes, still holding court like it doesn't know it's temporary. Like it doesn't know it will be replaced by morning. You slip from the raucous market now and into something quieter, more insidious, perhaps more heavily perfumed with empire and the faint, sticky scent of sugar boiling somewhere it shouldn't. Because as you wind deeper into this tale, you must follow the pineapple not just into drawing rooms and debt ledger dreams, but into the very soil it grew from. This, unfortunately, is where the fruit's gold-plated charm gets its most uncomfortable polish. The pineapple, for all its harmless social frolicking in London salons, had roots tangled tightly with colonial ambition. It was a fruit not born of British soil, but extracted, plucked from Caribbean plantations, run on sweat, fear, and blistered hands. And that, whether the Victorians like to admit it or not, was part of the pineapple's appeal. You're in Jamaica now, but not the resort. Brochure version. The sun is relentless here, not romantic. It burns skin, cracks lips, warps wooden crates until nails snap loose. Fields stretch outward in sticky, insect-thick lines, with pineapples rising like tiny spiked helmets from between the weeds. It's hot, it's heavy, and it's hard work. You walk between the rows, ankle-deep in churned red dirt, and you notice how many hands it takes to raise a single pineapple, to water it, to ward off pests, to gently coax it from the earth at the perfect moment. Too soon and it's bitter, too late and it turns. This isn't horticulture for pleasure. This is agriculture for empire. The workers here are mostly black, many descendants of enslaved people, some indentured, some nominally free, but locked into the kind of poverty that chains without cuffs. Their labor isn't seen, not in London, anyway. Not by the ladies rearranging napkins around a pineapple like it's a divine relic. In drawing rooms thousands of miles away, the conversation never includes these hands. The fruit is admired, but its origin, like so many colonial imports, is politely obscured. Wrapped in linen, displayed on crystal, not once questioned. Pineapples are packed tightly now, each wrapped in straw, stacked into crates. Some will rot before they reach Liverpool. Others will arrive blemished, their sheen dulled, their fragrance just a shade too sharp. Brokers will turn up their noses. Some may be sold at a discount to lower-tier clients who still want the illusion of wealth, but can't afford perfection. This stratification of fruit quality mirrors the very system that birthed it, a hierarchy of desirability, wrapped in politeness but sharpened by exploitation. Historians still argue just how much of Britain's pineapple obsession was fueled by its colonial ventures and how much was merely fashion following flavor. Some insist the fruit was always going to be a luxury, simply because of its difficulty to grow and transport. Others point out that the pineapple's rise coincided almost too neatly with the expansion of British holdings in the West Indies regions. That didn't just supply fruit, but sugar, rum, molasses, and endless nightmares for those forced to harvest them. Whatever the case, the symbolism became tangled. Owning a pineapple said more than "I'm rich," it whispered. I have reach. I have power. I am connected to places you can only imagine and people you will never meet. Of course, not all pineapples came from colonies. Some were grown in Britain, in vast, labor-intensive glass hothouses known as pineries. These were architectural marvels and horticultural nightmares. Picture long rows of glass panes, iron-framed and angled to catch the reluctant English sun. Inside, warmth, steam, damp soil. A strange mimicry of the tropics, built through coal and ingenuity. These pineries were statements in themselves. To build one said you were serious. To maintain one meant you had the staff. To successfully produce a pineapple in the British climate. That was sorcery. That was social nuclear weaponry, you imagine. Standing inside one now, wiping condensation off your forehead as you glance along rows of carefully nurtured pineapples, each with its own heat bed, its own watering schedule. Gardeners fuss like new parents. A single failed crop could mean social disaster. In some cases, the fruit was never eaten even by the owner. It was given as a gift to someone higher up the ladder, a duke, perhaps, or a royal visitor. Pineapples were passed like relics, and sometimes simply growing one was enough. There are stories of people who displayed their hothouse like a trophy room, showing guests the steaming glass womb where their fruit incubated. Eating it would have been like slaying the golden goose, and yet, even those grown in Britain owed their existence to colonial knowledge methods and tools extracted from the places Britain claimed and reinterpreted. It wasn't just the fruit that traveled. It was the science of how to force it to grow where it didn't belong. The empire didn't stop at borders. It came home and put down roots. Back in London, you find yourself at a soiree where two guests are discussing greenhouse strategy. "We've added another furnace to our east-facing wall," one says. "Seems to help with the frost." The other nods solemnly. "Still using coal?" "We're trying peat bricks, less smoke." And you smile. Quietly, because here, again, is the absurdity. Pineapple cultivation is being discussed like military strategy, each minor innovation treated as gospel. But never once does anyone mention the Caribbean, the fields, the hands, the fire at the core of the fruit. There is a moment, brief and strange, when a guest at the party does raise the topic. A young woman, perhaps too educated, perhaps too earnest, mentions the plantations, the conditions, the disparity. The conversation stills like a painting. Glasses hover mid-air. Someone coughs. Another murmurs something about not the time. Dear, the moment passes. The pineapple glistens on its pedestal, unbothered, untouched. That's the trick of it, really. The pineapple allowed the British to enjoy the fruits of empire without tasting the bitterness. It was sweet, spiky, mysterious. It spoke of luxury without ever explaining itself. And for a while, that was enough. It offered a sanitized fantasy one that fit neatly into parlors and portraits and dinner party menus. A fruit that looked just difficult enough to justify its price, but never quite enough to spark conscience. So you stand there, next to the table, watching candlelight dance along. The fruits ridges, and you wonder how something so golden could cast such a long shadow. You're back in the parlor again, but this one is different. There's something off about the air. It's quieter, heavier, filled not with the sharp chatter of who wore what or who's seeing whom, but with the reverent hush of wax. Yes, wax. Welcome to the age of imitation, when pineapples that once arrived bruised and panicked off ships now appeared immortal, sculpted in beeswax and perfection, never ripening, never rotting, always available, just like people wished their reputations were. The wax pineapple was the great equalizer, the socially acceptable lie, and for many women, a necessary one. Because while it was one thing to rent a real fruit for an evening, it was another to pretend you could afford to rent one every week. That's where wax stepped in, not to deceive, per se, but to offer a version of truth that fit within the tightly corseted reality of Victorian budgets. You walk through a room now, and the pineapples are everywhere. Not fresh, not fragrant, but eerily perfect. There's one on a sideboard, its surface buffed to a polite sheen. Another stands on a fireplace mantel, its fronds just a shade too symmetrical. A third rests under a glass dome, like a scientific specimen or a saint's relic. They don't fool everyone, especially not the fruit brokers who recognize the real thing by weight and scent, but they don't need to. They only need to fool the guests who want to be fooled. Illusion is a service, and wax pineapples performed it flawlessly. The process of making these wax marvels was meticulous. Artisans, many of them women, would study real pineapples for hours, noting how the light caught each curve, where the skin darkened, how the leaves curled at the edges. They'd sculpt the form by hand, layer in pigments, and finish with a thin coating of oil to mimic the faintly sticky sheen of ripe fruit. Some went further, embedding threads of real pineapple fibers to suggest authenticity. Others added a faint scent, usually clove and sugar water, enough to trigger imagination but not suspicion. These waxworks could cost nearly as much as a rental. Pineapple upfront, but they paid for themselves in longevity. A well-maintained wax pineapple could appear in a dozen dinner parties over several seasons. It didn't require special care beyond occasional dusting. And unlike the real thing, it never went soft. You imagine yourself at one of these events, seated beside a wax marvel that's been the centerpiece of 3 weddings, 4 housewarmings, and a single slightly awkward funeral tea. You're admiring its craftsmanship when a guest leans over and whispers, "Is it real?" And there it is, the question. The game, because answering truthfully might invite pity, or worse, honesty. But lying outright could be dangerous. So you do what most women in your position did. You smile, tilt your head and say, "A gift from my cousin in the colonies." Let them fill in the blanks. That's the beauty of wax. It doesn't talk back. Of course, the wax pineapple became more than just a substitute. It became its own kind of statement. For some women, owning a wax fruit meant not just aspiration, but cleverness. It meant resourcefulness. You'd hear them at teas saying things like, "Oh, I never trust imported fruit so fragile," or "Why waste money on something that turns in days?" They'd laugh gently at the expense of the very social system they were performing within, but make no mistake, they were still performing. The wax pineapple didn't rebel against the game. It just changed the rules. Some women even commissioned full wax fruit displays, entire tables of sculpted abundance, grapes and figs and melons that glistened like fresh produce under gaslight. These weren't just decorative. They were protective, providing an illusion of wealth that could keep questions at bay. A guest might leave thinking you'd just hosted a feast when in reality your pantry held little more than tea biscuits and hard cheese, and wax fruit didn't require staff. No gardener, no greenhouse, no risky shipping routes. It democratized luxury in the most Victorian way possible, through performance and careful illusion. Historians debate whether the rise of wax fruit marked the beginning of the pineapple's decline. Some argue that the abundance of imitation cheapened the symbol, made it less special. Others claim it extended the fruit's social reign by making it accessible to more households. The truth probably lies in the middle. As wax pineapples became more common, they lost some of their mystique. But they gained endurance. They became heirlooms. There are still some in museums today, brittle with age, their once glossy sheen dulled by decades of polite admiration. And then there's the matter of the great wax scandals, rare, but memorable, like the infamous evening at the Hampshire Manor Ball, where a guest leaned too close to a wax pineapple centerpiece, accidentally knocking a candle into its base and sending it into a slow, sticky melt that perfumed the room with burning beeswax and exposed its inner wires. Guests fled. The hostess wept. The pineapple died a second, more theatrical death. You chuckle softly at the thought, but you also see the tenderness in it. The desperation to be seen a certain way. To live inside the fantasy, even for a few hours. That's what the wax pineapple was, a fantasy with a shelf life. And it let people who'd never set foot near a plantation or a greenhouse feel, for one fleeting moment, like the center of a softer world. So you sit now in a room full of replicas, each fruit a perfect lie. You breathe in the faint scent of old wax and ambition. The real pineapples may have been long gone, devoured or discarded, but these remain. Silent, pristine, unspoiled by truth. Just like society wanted this. Now imagine, if you will, a very different kind of room. Not the candlelit drawing room of a wealthy hostess, nor the greenhouse cathedrals of aristocratic garden estates. No, this is smaller, dim. It smells of coal smoke, cabbage, and the faint, lingering echo of soap. You're in a working-class home, maybe in Manchester, maybe East London, where pineapples do not grace the table in wax or flesh, but they still live. In dreams, in rumors, in jokes and longing. Because while the upper classes used pineapples to signal what they had, the working class used them to imagine what might someday be possible. Or at least what they'd pretend, for a moment, to possess. Children here know the shape of a pineapple before they ever see one. It appears in street songs, in picture books, in shop window advertisements for cheap candies with names like Tropic Drops or Golden Wedges that taste mostly of syrup and lemon rind. The grocer 2 streets over has a hand-painted sign featuring a pineapple, though he's never sold a real one. That sign is the promise of abundance, exotic luxury condensed into a familiar form, sharp, golden, cartoonishly grand. For many families, the closest they come to the real fruit is the image of it stitched into a sampler or pressed onto the label of a bottle of cheap cologne. And yet, the pineapple still manages to mean something here. A girl might tell her sister, "When I'm rich, I'll have pineapples every Sunday." A boy might boast, "I saw one once through a window. It was taller than a boot." In the absence of the food itself, the myth grows richer. You see it in the way people joke, in the way they exaggerate. "She's got pineapple tastes and turnip means," someone might mutter about a neighbor with ideas above her station. Or, more fondly, "He bought her a pineapple tin for her dressing table, poor lad's in love." Tin was the great impersonator of the era. With the industrial boom came mass production, and with it, a sea of pineapple-patterned items that looked like luxury at a fraction of the price. There were biscuit tins embossed with pineapples, decorative boxes shaped like the fruit, even coin purses and sewing kits that mimicked its distinctive texture. For just a few shillings, you could own a piece of that myth. Of course, you weren't fooling anyone. But that wasn't really the point. You were participating. You were signaling quietly that you understood the code. And then there were the pineapple-themed experiences sold to the masses. Traveling exhibits popped up on fairgrounds and public greens, offering a glimpse of real Caribbean fruit for the price of a penny. Some of these were legitimate, if exploitative. Others were pure fabrication, a painted gourd, a wax replica, maybe even a pinnacone polished to a shine and lit dramatically from below. But the crowd didn't care. They came for the fantasy, for the idea that, just for a moment, they could be in on the joke that the rich never admitted was a joke to begin with. Public houses joined the fun too. The Pineapple Inn, the Golden Fruit Tavern, the Prickled Crown. These weren't high-end establishments. They sold warm beer and cold pies. But their signs did something clever. They turned aspiration into belonging. You might never eat a pineapple, but you could drink under one. You could meet your friends beneath a painted sign where the fruit hung proudly over the door, its crown, tilted just enough to seem mischievous. One pub even hosted an annual Pineapple Day, during which a papier-mâché fruit was paraded through the streets before being set atop the bar like a seasonal deity. Patrons wore paper fronds behind their ears and toasted with pineapple-flavored punch, rum, mostly. For that night, everyone had a pineapple. Of sorts, historians debate the cultural sincerity of all this. Was the working-class embrace of pineapple imagery a satire of upper-class pretensions? A hopeful mirroring? A form of passive resistance? Some argue it was simply fashion trickling down, as it always does, losing weight and irony as it descends. Others believe the symbolism remained potent, even as it changed context. The pineapple was never just about the fruit. It was about longing, imagination, and the quiet dignity of dreaming in color when your world was mostly gray. You walk now past a small kitchen where a mother is peeling potatoes. Above her, a framed sampler stitched by her daughter reads, "Welcome to our home," with a pineapple stitched clumsily but proudly in the center. It's crooked. The proportions are off. But the message is clear. This is a place of pride, of hospitality, of reaching for something just beyond reach. You step into a corner shop, its shelves lined with penny sweets and boot polish. Behind the counter sits a glass jar filled with yellow cubes labeled Tropical Fruit Chew. They taste nothing like pineapple. But that doesn't matter. The flavor is close enough to conjure the dream. And that, more than anything, was what the pineapple meant to people who would never hold one. Possibility. It was a ticket out. A hint that the world was bigger, richer, stranger than the alley outside your door. So here you are, drifting through the quieter corners of the Victorian world, far from the manicured lawns and imported silver. But the pineapple is here too, less grand maybe, but just as powerful. Because sometimes it's not the fruit that matters. It's the way people hold on to it, what they imagine when they see it, what it lets them believe. The pineapple, much like any social fashion, was bound to have its season. You can feel the shift in the air now. The candlelight still flickers. The drawing rooms still echo with polite laughter. But there's a subtle cooling of attention. It begins quietly, no dramatic crash. Just fewer pineapples at dinner parties. One hostess replaces hers with a towering floral arrangement. Another experiments with a pyramid of oranges. Someone dares to feature a roast goose as the centerpiece. Guests raise eyebrows, whisper innovative, and then forget to whisper. The pineapple, once so startling and strange, has become familiar, expected, and in the rigid circles of Victorian trendsetting, familiarity is death. You sit in one of those parlors now, and it takes a moment to notice. There's no pineapple. A few guests comment on it. Refreshing, one murmurs, as if a fruit had been overstaying its welcome. Another shrugs. Tiresome anyway. No one says it outright, but you can hear it in the silences. The pineapple has peaked. It's no longer an object of marvel, but one of memory. A visual cliché. The social power it once wielded is still remembered, but its presence no longer. Commands gasps or envy. And that is the beginning of the end. Why now? Historians still argue. Some point to improved shipping and preservation methods. By the 1870s, refrigerated transport was making formerly exotic foods more common. The pineapple, once a prince among produce, could now be found slightly battered but still golden in respectable grocers at a fraction of its former price. It no longer required an army of greenhouse keepers or a fortune in coal. It could, in theory, be eaten by anyone. And once it became edible in practice, its symbolic value rotted faster than its flesh ever did. You imagine the confusion of the old social guard, the women who once clutched pineapples like scepters, now watching younger debutantes decorate with tropical ferns or painted ostrich eggs. There's even a rumor circulating of a lady who served pineapple slice as actual slices at a picnic. Some called it vulgar. Others whispered she might be onto something. The shift had begun. No longer a status relic, the pineapple started re-entering kitchens, recipe books, and eventually, stomachs. And what a strange transition it was. There's a certain awkwardness to decommissioning a symbol, especially one so carefully enshrined in etiquette and illusion. The first time someone actually cut into a pineapple at a party, it must have felt like a scandal. The slicing of a sacred object, the breach of centuries of unspoken rules. But it happened. Gradually, then all at once. Cookbooks began including pineapple compotes, preserves, and jellies. By the end of the century, you could find pineapple upside-down puddings at railway inns and seaside cafes. What was once untouchable became garnish, and the wax pineapples? They lingered like ghost props from a forgotten play. Dusty, quietly accusatory. Some were packed away, stored in attics beside old parasols and yellowed calling cards. Others were melted down, their wax repurposed into candles or children's toys. A few remained defiantly on display, clinging to the past in households too proud or too sentimental to update their centerpieces. You can picture one now, sitting slightly askew on a lace runner, its sheen faded, a crack splitting its crown. It no longer commands awe. It's just there is for the brokers, the ones who once managed pineapple rentals with the secrecy of arms dealers. They pivoted, some moved on to floral arrangements. Others began renting fine china or exotic birds. A few stubborn holdouts clung to their ledgers, convinced the fruit would return. But fashion, once it shifts, rarely rewinds. And though the pineapple never vanished entirely, its age of supremacy was done. One story half legend, half probably true tells of a final grand attempt to reclaim the pineapple's prestige. A duchess in Surrey, desperate to outshine a rival's marble-floored orangery, hosted a ball themed entirely around the fruit. Pineapple-printed linens, pineapple-shaped ices, even dancers in yellow gowns shaped to resemble the fruit's curves. It was meant to be ironic, sophisticated. It was, by all accounts, deeply odd. The guests smiled politely. Some even praised the pudding, but no one was fooled. The pineapple, they knew, was done pretending, yet decline does not mean disappearance. The pineapple, stripped of its aristocratic armor, became something softer, humbler, and paradoxically, more enduring. It entered homes not as an untouchable relic, but as something you could slice, share, sweeten. It moved from centerpieces to kitchen tables. And in doing so, it became a part of daily life, embedded in memory rather than spectacle. You wander now through a modest Victorian dining room in the twilight of the century. A small bowl of pineapple jam sits near the bread. It's homemade, a little tart, a little uneven. The woman who made it hums softly as she wipes down the table, her sleeves rolled up, her wedding band glinting faintly in the gaslight. She doesn't know the pineapple's entire history. She doesn't need to. For her, it's just fruit, a treat. Something to enjoy, not to display. This is the quiet dignity of the pineapple's decline. It didn't crash or scandalize. It simply faded out of parlors, out of paintings, into pantry shelves and recipe cards. It stopped being a symbol of power and became a flavor, sweet, tangy, familiar. And maybe, in its way, that's the greatest transformation of all. Picture now a Victorian gentleman. Not one of the polished dukes from portraits, but the ambitious, waistcoat-straining kind, the middle-tier aristocrat, or newly minted industrialist who never quite gets the wine pairing right. He strides into a room, a little too loudly, with a cane that's more decorative than necessary, and under his arm, Yes, of course, a pineapple, not wrapped, not boxed. Just carried like a monogrammed handbag or a beloved terrier. You wonder, does he actually know what to do with it? Probably not. But that's hardly the point. The pineapple, at this stage in its historical theater, has shifted again. For men like him, it's no longer a hostess's silent social spell. It's a performative accessory, an edible trophy, a visual resume. And boy, do they flaunt it. These men weren't content to let the pineapple rest quietly at the center of a table. No, they turned it into spectacle. They brought it to dinners like guests. They ordered portraits where the fruit sat prominently in their lap, as if it had earned a degree from Cambridge. Some even tried, God's help them, to grow their own without a gardener, investing in pamphlets and absurd contraptions for in-home pineapple cultivation. There are drawings from period magazines showing a gentleman in slippers and smoking jacket, peering into a glass case in his study, checking on his one sickly pineapple sprout as if it might sprout a title. You're now seated at a gentleman's club where one such fellow, let's call him Mr. Fosgrove, has just placed a pineapple on the table beside his brandy. It's not for sharing, it's for being seen. He clears his throat, eager for questions he's already prepared answers for. Imported, he says casually, from a friend in Trinidad. The others nod. They know it's rented or gifted, or worse, a second-hand me-down. But in this performance, nobody calls bluff. The pineapple buys him 15 minutes of relevance. And sometimes, that's all a man like Fosgrove needs. The fruit became a flex, a currency of masculinity wrapped in its own contradiction. It was. Soft on the inside, yes, but its tough, spiked armor and impossible import route gave it a kind of rugged prestige. It said, "I have access. I have heat. I have the resources to make this impossible fruit appear in the middle of gray, rainy Britain." And when you place something impossible next to your cravat and monogrammed cufflinks, you start to believe your own myth. Of course, not all men carried pineapples around like social hall passes. Some wielded them in more controlled, calculated ways. A government official might order pineapple preserves for a diplomatic dinner, subtle but intentional. A shipping magnate might name his newest cargo vessel the Golden Crown, dropping not-so-subtle hints about where his money came from. Pineapples crept into men's spaces the way good gossip does, indirectly, then everywhere. They were featured in smoking room wallpaper, carved into side tables, and even worked into the handles of presentation swords given to colonial officers. For gallantry abroad and service to fruit. You imagine someone saying, there's even a recorded case, though historians still squint at it skeptically, of a man proposing marriage with a pineapple. No ring, just the fruit. He was not accepted, and the pineapple was later served at his cousin's wedding. Symbolism, always tricky, and yet for all their theatrics, most men never touch the pineapple beyond its performative value. They didn't peel it, they didn't cut it, they certainly didn't cook it. That remained the domain of the household staff, or, in some rare and quietly radical cases, the lady of the house herself, using a knife with both precision and a vague sense of defiance. But the men? They were content to parade it, to own it briefly, in gesture, if not digestion. Historians still argue about this gendered performance, the divide between the male pineapple as flag and the female pineapple as hosting weapon. Some believe the masculine posturing around pineapples was a natural extension of colonial masculinity, possession, conquest, display. Others suggest it was a reaction, a way for men to reclaim a symbol that had, for a time, become feminized by drawing room ritual. Either way, the result was often theatrical and at times laughable. Satirical prints began mocking these pineapple-toting gents, depicting them as dandies juggling tropical fruit while women rolled their eyes in the background. One especially cruel cartoon shows a man proposing to Parliament that pineapples be adopted as the official British hat. The caption reads, "Nothing more regal than a crown that can be stewed." The satire stung because it was too close to truth. The line between serious and silly was always razor thin in Victorian fashion. And yet, among all this posturing, there's something almost endearing about the pineapple's role in male vanity. It was a brief window during which ambition, insecurity, and imported produce intersected in the most harmless of ways. No wars were started over pineapples. Well, not officially. No reputations were built solely on fruit. But the desire to impress, to belong, to outshine, that ran as ripe in men's clubs as it did in garden parties. So here you sit, in a room thick with cigar smoke and awkward pride, listening to yet another man explain the complexities of pineapple. Soil acidity, as if he invented it. He taps the fruit for emphasis, misquotes a botanist, and nearly drops it during a flourish. You smile politely, sip your drink, and wait for the next guest to arrive, hopefully without produce. Step into the glass and coal-scented heat of a Victorian pinery, the sort of place where science and vanity bump elbows in the steamy fog of overachievement. This isn't your grandmother's garden or some modest herb plot behind a cottage. No, this is a purpose-built cathedral to a single fruit. Imagine rows of glass panels arched overhead like stained glass windows, sunlight bleeding through the grime of a London sky, filtered by soot and desperation. Beneath your feet, gravel walks, damp soil beds, and the soft hiss of steam piping whispering along brick-lined trenches. And all around you, rows of pineapples at various stages of ambition. You are in the heart of botanical hubris. This is where Victorian elites came to prove their worth, not through art or letters or even public service, but through gardening. Growing a pineapple in Britain was no casual flex. It was a full-time commitment, a horticultural high-wire act requiring heat, timing, knowledge, and servants who didn't hate you. And the payoff wasn't juice, it was power. Successfully coaxing a pineapple to ripen beneath British skies said you were more than wealthy. It said you were in control of nature. You'd bent the tropics to your will, one coal-stoked hothouse at a time. You pass a gardener now, shirt sleeves rolled up, fingers stained with the sap of plants he'll never taste. He tends the fruit with the reverence of a monk polishing relics. His employer? Upstairs, sipping tea, bragging to a neighbor that her pineapples have developed a particularly golden hue this season. He won't mention the boy who sleeps near the furnace to maintain the temperature at night. He won't mention the mold outbreaks, the fungal dramas, the insects smuggled in on imported bark. To her, the fruit is a symbol. To the gardener, it's a daily battle against decay. The logistics of a Victorian pinery were absurd. Specialized heating systems ran day and night, burning coal at a rate that made chimney sweeps wince. Thermometers were checked hourly. Beds were layered in tan fermented bark and manure to generate gentle ambient heat. Some gardens had elaborate trench systems carrying warm water beneath the beds, while others relied on coal-fired stoves so inefficient they routinely roasted the gardeners more than the plants. Glass had to be scrubbed constantly to ensure light penetration. The pineapples themselves required hand pollination in some cases, because the natural pollinators didn't survive in this artificial Eden. It was a delicate, finicky process, ripe with failure, and yet they did it, again and again. Some pineries specialized, producing nothing but pineapples and quietly selling them to wealthy households too proud to rent from Covent Garden. Others used the fruit as bait and excuse to draw guests to their estate, where they could casually point to the hothouse and say, "Oh yes, we do our own." The pineapple was the crown jewel in the Victorian greenhouse kingdom, surpassing even exotic orchids or imported citrus in its sheer symbolic gravity. Historians note that pineries were especially popular among the nouveau rich industrialists, shipping magnates, and recently ennobled families eager to cement their place in society. They might lack titles, but by God, they could grow a pineapple in Yorkshire. And that, in some circles, was just as impressive. But even among the elite, there was competition. Entire articles were written in gardening journals about pineapple varieties: Queen, Smooth Cayenne, Red Spanish, each with its own flavor profile, growth time, and aesthetic appeal. Debates raged over the best soil acidity, the precise hours of daylight needed, the superiority of clay pots versus wooden troughs. It wasn't just gardening, it was war. Quiet, passive-aggressive, pineapple-based war. You walk through one of these glass temples, watching as gardeners whisper among themselves, measuring leaf length, comparing notes, adjusting steam vents with the solemnity of surgeons. You pass a chalkboard where someone has scrawled 4 days to ripening, pray for warmth. In one corner, a fruit hangs heavy and golden from its stem, its scent faintly sweet, its crown perfect. It will be cut tomorrow, cleaned, polished, and placed on a table it will never be eaten from. A footman will carry it in, arms straight, eyes down, like a sacrament. The guests will murmur. Someone will ask, "Was it grown here?" And the host will smile, "Of course." And the gardener, who risked frostbite and mold inhalation and endless coal stoking, will be invisible. Some garden journals from the era even offered pineapple diaries, day-by-day logs for aspiring growers to record their progress. There, filled with poetic despair, March 17th, spotted leaf spot. Applied lime, weather too dim. April 4th, frond growth satisfactory. Prayers continue. One man name withheld reported speaking to his pineapples daily in Latin, convinced. It improved ripening. It didn't. But the ritual stuck. There were even pineapple competitions. Yes, actual judged events where fruits were evaluated not for taste, but for symmetry, crown fullness, and color. Winners received medals. Losers received ... silence. The shame of a lopsided pineapple was real. One woman reportedly refused to attend her own anniversary dinner after her greenhouse produced a fruit with a slight discoloration near the base. Society, as ever, had no chill. And then, sometimes, things went wrong. Heating systems failed. Fires broke out. Storms shattered glass. Whole crops were lost. A pineapple house was expensive to build, but even more expensive to lose. There's a documented case of a gentleman who suffered a nervous collapse after. His prized pinery was destroyed in a hailstorm. He never recovered, wrote his sister. He simply could not speak of fruit again. But the madness made sense. Because in an empire obsessed with dominion, nothing said mastery like growing sunshine fruit in fog-choked Britain. It was proof that you could own not just land and labor, but climate itself. And so they built and burned and grew. All for fruit most of them never even tasted. You leave the pinery now. Steam clouding your vision, the scent of wet earth clinging to your coat. Behind you, glass creaks, soil steams, and somewhere in the rows, a golden crown begins to tilt, just slightly, toward rot. Now let's slip into the awkward hush of diplomacy. The kind where every napkin fold, every fork placement, every drop of gravy that dares stray too far across the porcelain is part of a game. You're seated at a banquet, now not a cozy dinner party, but the kind of state event where entire tables are polished to death, languages are translated mid-bite, and the fruit on the sideboard has more political tension than the prime minister's. Smile. And there it is, of course, the pineapple. Front and center, not just for decoration, no. Tonight, this prickled grenade has been deployed with intent. Because believe it or not, pineapples have gone to war. Not with cannons or armies, but with glances, side comments, and poorly veiled insults wrapped in pastry crust. You see, in the late Victorian period, the pineapple's symbolic weight was understood beyond British drawing rooms. European courts, colonial governors, and foreign dignitaries had all seen the fruit, tasted it, gifted it, and they knew what it meant. It was wealth, it was access, it was heat in a place that shouldn't have any. So when it appeared at a diplomatic event, it was a message, a flex, and sometimes a slap. One story that gets told, more often in whispers than history books, is that of the Vienna dinner incident of 1884. The British ambassador, hosting a formal dinner for Austrian ministers, insisted that each table include not one but two whole pineapples, perfect, symmetrical, and clearly not local. He made a point to note that they had come directly from an estate recently improved in Ceylon, a line so casually colonial it drew a flinch from the French ambassador, who was already irritated he hadn't been offered first toast. The Austrians, polite to a fault, made no comment. But days later, at their reciprocal event, every dish on the table included pineapple. Pineapple soup, pineapple glazed duck, pineapple ices, even pineapple-infused wine. The implication was clear. If Britain wanted to make the pineapple a symbol, Vienna would run it into the ground with a dessert spoon. Back in London, word of the incident spread quickly through diplomatic circles. It became known as the pineapple course, and it was cited for months as an example of fruit-based retaliation. Was it petty? Absolutely. Was it effective? Without question. And it wasn't an isolated case. Pineapples cropped up in letters between envoys, in snide memoirs, even in caricatures. In one cartoon, a portly diplomat offers a pineapple to Queen Victoria, who replies with visible dismay. Again? The caption read, "Tropically overplayed." But the tension wasn't limited to Europe. In the colonies, pineapples were loaded. Symbols. When British governors in India or the Caribbean served pineapple dishes at formal dinners, it was as much a display of dominance as hospitality. "We have your fruit in abundance," the message said, "and we serve it back to you, garnished and chilled." In reply, some local dignitaries sent back enormous fruits of their own pineapples, the size of footballs, often packed in ornate crates with floral decorations and poetry. A kind of one-upmanship emerged, each side pretending it was all about flavor when everyone knew it was really about reach, and sometimes pineapples were withheld. That was the diplomatic equivalent of a cold shoulder. One foreign dignitary reportedly left a London event early because he was offered only pears at the dessert table. "I understand," he said, standing, "that we are no longer welcome." The hostess, utterly bewildered, sent a pineapple to his hotel room the next morning with a note reading, "A simple oversight, not a political statement." It didn't help. Historians continue to debate how many of these stories are real and how many were the product of high society gossip machines. Some letters confirm the events, others contradict them. But what's undeniable is that the pineapple had become a part of diplomatic language. Not officially, not in treaties or speeches, but in the choreography of state dinners, where the subtext of fruit often carried more weight than the text of toast. Back in Britain, the Foreign Office eventually issued quiet guidelines, never formalized but widely obeyed, about pineapple use in sensitive contexts. Don't overuse. Don't serve it when the guest of honor grows it natively. Don't imply superiority by showcasing it alone. One enterprising junior clerk even drafted a memo titled "Tropical Fruit in Colonial Interactions, Notes on Appropriateness," which included such gems as, "If serving pineapple to a Fijian chief, avoid making comparisons to English cultivation. Methods, and under no circumstances mention the greenhouse when dining with Brazilians." That memo never made it into official policy, but it lived in filing cabinets and footnotes for years. Meanwhile, in the background, pineapples continued to trickle into more mundane political spaces: city council banquets, mayor's balls, graduation, dinners at military academies. And each time, they carried with them a faint echo of empire, of competition, of long-stewed agendas garnished with syrup. Even the newspapers began picking up on it. "Fruitful diplomacy," one headline read, over a piece about a pineapple-themed trade negotiation dinner in Cape Town. "Golden fruit, frosty glances," teased another, following a slightly disastrous ambassadorial lunch in Moscow. The irony, of course, was that many of the people using pineapples as diplomatic tools had never grown one, peeled one, or really even liked the taste. But that was irrelevant. It wasn't about the fruit. It was about what it signified, a little spiny ambassador all on its own, traveling from table to table with secrets tucked between its ridges. And now you sit quietly at one of those long, echoing tables, watching the footmen carry in trays. The scent of roasted meats and polished wood hangs heavy. At the center, a pineapple gleams beneath the chandelier. It's not large. It's not perfect, but its presence is deliberate. A message. In skin and sugar. What it says depends entirely on who's looking and who's pretending not to. Imagine now, late in the season, a quiet supper held in a genteel home, one of those places that still clings to its good curtains, though the furniture has begun to fray at the edges. You're sitting across from a woman in an aging silk gown, her hair pinned neatly, her expression polite but wary. There's a hush over the table, not from awe or reverence, but something far less glamorous, anxiety. Because tonight, the pineapple centerpiece is not well. It slouches slightly, its crown wilted, its once golden skin now mottled in shades of brown and blotched green. The smell, faint but creeping, is unmistakable. The fruit is turning. And the hostess knows it. You can almost feel her internal scream weeks. Of careful planning, the borrowed lace cloth, the polished silver, all potentially undone by a bit of fermentation and the merciless advance of decay. This is the shadow side of pineapple prestige, reputation rot. And it's as vicious as the fruit's scent is sweet. Because once you commit to the display, there's no turning back. That fruit has to last the evening. It must be admired. It cannot betray you. There were no rescue plans in place for a collapsing pineapple. Etiquette manuals didn't include a protocol for what to do if the skin starts to sink during soup. There was no mid-dinner substitution, no elegant distraction that could replace a fruit-shaped anchor on which the entire social performance hinged. Once rot set in, so too did rumor. Because if a pineapple spoiled in public, it wasn't just a bad piece of fruit. It was a bad omen. You glance now across the table. Someone else has noticed. A guest wrinkles her nose, just subtly, and raises an eyebrow. Another leans toward her husband and murmurs behind a napkin. You can almost hear it. Is it rented? Has she had it too long? Do you think it's even real? These aren't questions about fruit. They're questions about class, honesty, stability. And just like that, the pineapple becomes radioactive. There's a story part legend, part lesson about Lady Thurston Smythe and the Great. Fruit debacle of 1871. Known for hosting impeccable teas, she had made her pineapple centerpiece a trademark. Every Friday, without fail, a glistening, perfect fruit in the center of the table. Until, one day, it wasn't. Guests arrived to find the pineapple darkened, its base sticky, its scent unmistakably sour. She claimed it was intentional. A tropical aesthetic, she said, but no one believed her. Within weeks, invitations slowed, rumors swelled. Her husband reportedly stopped attending dinners altogether. And 2 years later, they moved to Bath. All from one fruit gone wrong. This fear, this gnawing awareness that beauty was temporary and rot inevitable, haunted every woman who dared center a pineapple on her table. It wasn't just a piece of produce. It was a test of control. Could you keep it fresh long enough? Could you hide the blemishes? Did you know how to angle the candles to mask the bruising? Because if you didn't, if the fruit revealed your limits, you were exposed. And yet, the cover-ups were elaborate. Hostesses rotated the pineapple slightly each night, using linen folds or strategically placed serving spoons to hide flaws. They dabbed vinegar on the base to suppress the scent, knowing full well that nothing truly masked overripe pineapple. Some desperate few even attempted touch-ups with paint, wax, or ink, filling in discolored gaps with the precision of forgery artists. It was a farce, yes, but one performed with trembling dignity. Servants, too, became part of the preservation process. A well-trained maid might check the pineapple each morning, reporting any soft spots in hushed tones. Some were instructed to brush the surface lightly with rosewater to disguise early fermentation. A clever footman might rearrange the table layout mid-dinner if a guest leaned too close. These acts of subtle deception were part of the job, as essential as polishing the silver or preventing the dog from licking the dessert tray. And then there was the rot that couldn't be hidden. The pineapples that collapsed mid-course, or worse, those that were touched. A curious child reaching up to poke the surface, only to have her fingers sink slightly into a sticky spot. A guest emboldened by wine, lifting the fruit for a better look and triggering a cascade of soft, unspeakable goo onto the tablecloth. These moments became legend. They spread through salons like wildfire, not because of the fruit itself, but because of what it revealed. You couldn't keep up. You'd let something slip. And if you couldn't manage a piece of fruit, how could you manage your household? Historians continue to unpick how real these social consequences were versus how exaggerated they became through retelling. Some argue that the fear of rot was greater than its actual fallout. Others suggest that in a world so fixated on appearances, even the smallest failure could be fatal. What's clear is that the pineapple's slow descent into ruin became a Mirror for all the ways Victorian society demanded performance at the cost of honesty. And so the rituals grew more elaborate. Some women timed their events precisely around fruit life cycles. A dinner on Thursday meant receiving the pineapple. Wednesday morning, only uncrating it after sunset, keeping it cool but not chilled, rotating it every 2 hours until the guests arrived. One misstep and the whole illusion dissolved. There's something almost cruel in that, isn't there? That a society could demand so much from an object so fragile. You're back at the table now. The pineapple is quiet. It hasn't moved, but you can feel it sagging under the weight of expectation. The candles flicker. A scent rises, just faintly, not putrid, but undeniably sweet in a way that says, I am nearing the end. And the hostess, she smiles. Her hands are clasped too tightly. Her eyes flick between guests and the fruit, calculating if anyone has noticed. She won't let this ruin the evening. But she knows. The rot has begun. And in this room, once that knowledge takes root, it can't be plucked out. You're somewhere between fact and farce now, in the twilight of the Victorian pineapple's reign. And the story you're drifting into feels like it could have been penned by Dickens on a sugar high. It's 1882, the heart of London's social season, and the stage is set for one of the strangest, quietest scandals to ever ripple through Mayfair: the theft of a single pineapple. Not a jewel-encrusted heirloom or an ivory-handled saber. Just one particularly photogenic, freshly imported, painfully expensive pineapple that had been positioned at the heart of Lady Cornelia Wexbridge's midsummer ball. And yet, when the footman went to collect it the next morning, it was gone. Not rotten, not bitten. Simply vanished. Now understand, this wasn't just an inconvenience. This was the pineapple. The one she'd had couriered under guard from a private hothouse in Devon. The one she'd ordered monogrammed linen for. The one that had been mentioned in the Morning Post's Items of Interest column as an expected triumph of centerpiece curation. Its disappearance wasn't just theft. It was social sabotage. And within 24 hours, it was all anyone could talk about. You picture the scene. Cornelia, resplendent in lilac silk, walking through her drawing room with the unshakable certainty of a woman who has out-hosted every other hostess this quarter. Her guests still recovering from champagne and waltzes, her servants clearing candelabras with military precision, and then that awful silence. The empty pedestal, the absence, the little frond-shaped imprint still visible in the linen. The scream, stifled for propriety's sake, that came out instead as, "Has anyone moved the fruit?" Suspects were immediate and abundant. A jealous rival, perhaps someone slighted over an unextended invitation. A disgruntled footman with a flair for revenge. A clumsy guest who dropped it and panicked. Theories flew. One newspaper offered a 10-shilling reward for information, publishing a small woodcut illustration of the missing fruit. A columnist for the satirical Gazette mocked it ruthlessly, writing, "If only our ministers guarded policy as well as they guard produce, the empire would be safe indeed." But not everyone laughed. In a society built on optics, the implications were catastrophic. Cornelia's pineapple was supposed to symbolize her dominion over fashion, taste, even horticulture. And now, it symbolized only her vulnerability. Her party, once called the event of the season, was now referred to, in increasingly breathless whispers, as the ball without fruit. Within days, counter-rumors surfaced. Someone claimed to have seen a pineapple being passed between guests like a prize ham at a picnic. Another insisted it had been mistaken for a centerpiece prop and thrown out with the flowers. A particularly creative version had the pineapple reappear, sliced and served at a rival's garden luncheon, though no one could agree on which rival, or whether the pineapple in question had the telltale reddish splotch near its base. Cornelia, for her part, maintained composure. She issued no public comment, but quietly canceled 3 appearances and was later seen hosting significantly smaller dinners, with far less decorative ambition. Meanwhile, London society took to calling any social gaffe a bit of pineapple business. For weeks, no hostess could place a fruit on her table without someone muttering, "Do keep an eye on that one." Years later, in a half-forgotten memoir published by a minor cousin, the truth emerged. The pineapple had been taken as a dare by a tipsy lieutenant named Jasper Rothley, egged on by 3 other men and the misguided belief that the fruit was ornamental. He smuggled it out in a coat lined with brandy bottles, brought it to his club, and proudly placed it on the bar. It rotted there over 3 days, slowly collapsing beneath the gas lamps, while no one dared touch it out of fear they'd be accused of the theft. By the time Rothley realized the consequences of his prank, the social damage was irreversible. He attempted an apology by sending Cornelia a crate of oranges. She never replied. This story, once properly circulated, became part of pineapple lore. It was retold at dinner parties, parodied in plays, referenced in advertisements. "Don't be like Rothley," said one pamphlet for secure fruit transport services. Another cheeky confectioner released a dessert called Cornelia's Regret, a pineapple tart with a hollow center. The incident became a metaphor, not just for the fragility of reputation, but for the absurdity of the entire pineapple saga. Here was a fruit that once symbolized empire, ambition, flirtation, and prestige. Now reduced to a punchline involving sticky upholstery and coat lining. Historians continue to cite the theft as a tipping point in pineapple culture. Not because it ended anything directly, but because it exposed the system's seams. It showed how much weight had been placed on an object that could be misplaced like a glove or a cigar case. It wasn't the theft itself. It was that something so valuable, so ritually untouchable, could just ish. No fanfare. No reprieve. Just gone. And perhaps, in that way, the missing pineapple became the perfect symbol for the end of the era. Something once dazzling, now quietly spoiled. The laughter it provoked was the same kind that follows any empire in decline. It wasn't malicious. Just tired. So now you're here, in that same quiet drawing room, watching a fruit-shaped void echo louder than music ever did. The pedestal remains, its linen still bearing a ring of residue. No one speaks of it directly, but everyone remembers. Because in the end, it wasn't the pineapple's presence that sealed its legend. It was the scandal of its absence. You return now to the drawing rooms and parlors, not in their heyday, but in their gentle, inevitable fading. It's the final decade of the 19th century. The empire has grown heavy, and the pineapple, once the exotic trophy of all that imperial ambition, has quietly relinquished its crown. You can sense the change not in grand pronouncements or magazine essays, but in small domestic details. The pineapple is still there, yes, but now it's part of the wallpaper. Literally, you spot it on curtains, faintly embroidered on guest towels, even stamped onto the back of a commemorative tea tray. It's not the star anymore. It's background. Noise. A ghost of former glory rendered in cotton print and biscuit tins. In many ways, its decline feels merciful. After decades of being poked, polished, worshipped, and weaponized in the battlefield of dinner parties, the pineapple has slipped into what some might call retirement. It no longer needs to prove anything. It's no longer perched atop polished silver at center tables, no longer delivered by velvet-lined crates and trembling servants. It appears now in puddings, in cordial syrups, and in the occasional risk cocktail. Its days of dominance are done. It has become normal. What brought this fall from grace? In a word, logistics. The same imperial engine that once made pineapples rare and awe-inspiring eventually made them dull. Advances in refrigeration, steam-powered shipping, and commercial agriculture turned pineapples from mysterious imports into manageable commodities. No longer did they need to survive a 3-week voyage in a straw-lined crate. They could now be chilled, boxed, and distributed with mathematical efficiency. One moment, they were tokens of imperial reach. The next, they were something your aunt in Brighton served with ham. As pineapples became accessible, their symbolic power faded. Their mystique was undone, not by scandal or satire, but by availability. You could now buy one for less than the cost of a new hat. They showed up in recipes with such casual frequency: pineapple chutney, pineapple jelly, pineapple glazed lamb, that they lost their luster. To serve a pineapple was no longer a performance. It was a recipe. And it wasn't just about cost. Cultural fashion had moved on. Where once society prized the ornamental and the symbolic, the new wave of modernity leaned toward utility. The arts and crafts movement, with its celebration of honest materials and form following function, looked at the pineapple with mild embarrassment. Art Nouveau designers found it too symmetrical. The Edwardians found it quaint. And the next generation? They barely noticed it at all. Still, there were holdouts. Some of the old guard clung to their wax pineapples, now yellowed with age and tucked beside china cabinets. A few ambitious hostesses, nostalgic or stubborn, still presented the fruit as a centerpiece at winter dinners, insisting it was just tradition. But these gestures felt more like reenactments than rituals, historical cosplay for the socially anxious. You could almost hear the mental gymnastics. No, it's not about status, it's just festive. Then there were the collectors. As the pineapple faded from mainstream fashion, it rose in the world of the eccentric enthusiast. You'd find whole collections: pineapple-shaped inkwells, paperweights, lamp finials. One woman in Devonshire reportedly built an entire sideboard covered in carved pineapples, claiming it was a tribute to the golden age of hospitality. Some began to romanticize the fruit's heyday, treating the pineapple not as a relic of snobbery, but as a symbol of a more gracious era. They ignored the rot, the deception, the rented illusions. Instead, they remembered the shimmer. It's during this time that the pineapple starts appearing in nostalgia prints, sepia-toned illustrations of dinner parties, idealized greenhouse scenes, and romanticized courtship tableaux, all with pineapples smuggled into the background like half-forgotten monarchs. The fruit is no longer central to the action, but it's present, lingering, watching, like a retired actor attending opening night in a borrowed tux. There's a quiet kind of dignity in this descent. Unlike other status symbols that vanish in scandal or irrelevance, the pineapple softened into the scenery. It was never fully discarded. It just became benign, less fruit, more motif. A pleasant shape. A nod to the past that no longer needs to be explained. And so you find yourself now in one of these twilight parlors. The house smells of old books, beeswax, and something gently stewing on the stove. There's a pineapple pattern on the wallpaper. Border not gaudy, just faint enough to catch the eye if you're looking for it. A teacup sits nearby, its handle shaped like a leafy crown. No one comments. No one mentions trade routes or hotbeds or the perils of colonial shipping. The fruit is there, not to dazzle or intimidate, but simply to decorate. You turn the page of a recipe book. Pineapple upside-down cake, it says, in looping script. There's no footnote, no apology, no indication that this dish was once the subject of whispered rivalry and parlor room warfare. It's just cake now, sweet, familiar. A little bit old-fashioned. You smile, because you know the truth. You've seen the pineapple rise, glitter, and curdle. You've watched it ruin reputations and rescue parties. You know it was once carried under armed guard and whispered about in the same breath as dowries. But here, in this quiet corner of history, it has made peace with itself. No longer a weapon. No longer a symbol. Just a fruit. And maybe, finally, that's enough. You're stepping now into a gallery of faded portraits, embroidered chairs, and stories that never made it into textbooks. Because tonight is for the women. The ones who wore the gloves, poured the tea, and positioned the pineapples with the precision of generals placing troops. These weren't the queens of the realm, but the queens of the room. The ones who knew that a pineapple wasn't just fruit, it was flair, strategy, and shield. And yet, history rarely remembers them, so we do it here, slowly, sweetly. Like peeling. Back the rind. Let's begin with the hostesses, the real ones. The women who ran drawing rooms like warships and scheduled their social calendars with military precision. These weren't idle wives flitting from one tea to another. They were tacticians, trendsetters, and sometimes quiet revolutionaries in silk sleeves. They understood that the pineapple was more than garnish. It was performance. And they became its high priests, choreographing entire evenings around the fruit's placement and lifespan. A pineapple didn't just sit on a table. It anchored an entire ecosystem of glances, gossip, and ambition. Some of these women became locally legendary. Lady Mariah Fexley, for instance, whose pineapple arrangements were said to match the flowers of every dress in the room, though no one ever saw her take a bite. Or Miss Georgiana Humpleton, who once carried her own wax pineapple from event to event in a velvet-lined satchel, just in case the hostess was less prepared than she ought to be. These weren't acts of vanity. They were survival tactics. In a world that offered very few weapons to women without wealth or title, the pineapple was a social passport, and they wielded it like a saber. But beyond the hostesses were the helpers, the women behind the curtain, often literally, who made the pineapple dream function. The housemaids who polished the display trays. The cooks who knew how to candy pineapple slices without burning them. The governesses who embroidered pineapple motifs into samplers to teach girls both needlework and aspiration. These women rarely touched the fruit itself, except to clean up after it, but they lived in its shadow. When the pineapple was good, it elevated the house. When it turned, they were the first blamed. There's one documented case in 1873 where a pineapple centerpiece collapsed mid-luncheon, leaking syrup and reputation onto an heirloom lace tablecloth. The blame? Not on the hostess, but the scullery maid who had unwrapped it too early. She was dismissed that evening, and her name scrawled out of the household ledger as though she'd never been there. That's the cruelty of fruit-based social systems. They spoiled downwards. And yet, some women managed to turn even this fragile power into opportunity. There were pineapple dressmakers, crafting gowns with subtle nods to the fruit's shape and sheen bodices with ridged stitching, skirts that flared like leafy crowns. There were pineapple-themed salon writers, crafting poems and satire that danced around the fruit's ridiculous rise. And of course, there were artist women sketching pineapples into margins of letters, adding them to embroidery samplers as symbols of aspiration, hospitality, or in one case, defiance. A surviving sampler from 1881 reads, "I do not wish for thrones or pearls, just one good fruit and peace with girls." The pineapple in the corner wears a crown, smirking. Historians still debate the extent to which women consciously manipulated pineapple symbolism, or whether it was simply the language they were given. But in letters, diaries, and recipe books, you find evidence of quiet rebellion. A woman writes, "Tonight I served no centerpiece. I am too tired of pretending my larder is a stage." Another, in the margin of her gardening log, notes, "Let the fruit fall. I'll display daffodils instead." These aren't declarations, they're sighs. But they count. And then there are the women who rejected the pineapple altogether, not out of scorn, but practicality. They gave up the performance, not because they lacked the means, but because they saw through it. Some of them hosted simpler dinners. Others quietly used wax versions and dared guests to call them out. A few turned to other fruits, melons, oranges, even apples, reclaiming local harvest as a form of quiet resistance. One hostess famously declared, "I do not traffic in the dreams of empire. I serve what grows here." It shocked her circle. She wasn't invited back to certain homes, but she didn't seem to mind. You picture them now, these forgotten fruit-wielding women, sitting in candlelight, worrying over bruises, counting days, whispering to their daughters not just how to arrange a centerpiece, but how to survive a room that will judge you before you speak. The pineapple was never just for guests, it was for them. A mirror, a crown, a dare. Even now, long after its heyday, you can see their touch. In faded cookbooks passed down 3 generations. In china patterns that still bear the faint ghost of pineapple ridges. In a grandmother's needlepoint pillow that features the fruit not in gold, but in soft green and brown. Less regal, more real. And that perhaps is the quiet triumph of these women. They took a fruit meant to dazzle, to alienate, to impress, and they made it part of home. They demystified it, softened its edges, turned it from symbol to story. Not by shouting or declaring, but by continuing. By baking it into tarts, by painting it onto walls, by handing it down, one slice at a time, until the fruit that once sat atop imperial ambitions now sits beside a pot of tea. You sit with them, now listening. The candles flicker low. There's no pressure here. No centerpieces, just stories, just warmth. The pineapple, once guarded like a secret, is now just a flavor. And the women who carried it, shielded it, mocked it, or ignored it, they're the reason we remember. And now finally, you arrive at the soft edges of the tale. The fruit is no longer on a pedestal. It isn't being polished by candlelight or flanked by napkin swans. It rests quietly now in wallpaper patterns, in tea towel borders, in the faintly ridiculous knob on a cupboard drawer. The Victorian pineapple has ceased to rule. It has become background, texture, memory, and that, somehow, is the most dignified ending of all. You're in a modern antique shop now, dust particles waltzing through lazy afternoon light. There's a musty calm here, the smell of paper and wood polish, of things once treasured, now waiting for someone else to find value in them again. You pass a stack of old cookbooks, cracked spines and penciled notes in the margins. In one, there's a recipe, pineapple trifle, for Easter or when impressing cousins. The instructions are vague. The handwriting is careful. It's from a time when pineapples were still a little exciting, but no longer untouchable. Nearby, a wax pineapple sits quietly on a shelf, brittle around the fronds, its glaze dulled by years. It's not for sale, but it hasn't been thrown away either. Just waiting. A nod to a time when it was powerful, ridiculous, and a little bit sacred. A tag tied to it reads, "Unknown maker." Likely 1890s, still smells faintly of beeswax and nostalgia. You lift it gently. It doesn't weigh much anymore. Elsewhere in the shop are echoes. A silver napkin ring shaped like a pineapple crown. A threadbare tapestry cushion with golden fruit stitched in the center. A framed cross-stitch sampler declaring, "Welcome to our home," with a pineapple perched above the lettering like an afterthought with a crown. These are the after-images of an era that once held this fruit aloft like it meant everything, and then slowly let it go. Historians today, when they mention Victorian pineapples, tend to do so with a mix of amusement and curiosity. They cite the shipping records, the greenhouse blueprints, the etiquette books with chapters devoted to fruit display. They debate how widespread the obsession really was, whether it was mostly a London eccentricity or a broader cultural phenomenon. But what they all agree on is this: the pineapple meant something. Not just in the way it was used, but in the way it was feared, desired, whispered about, and eventually forgotten. Its legacy lingers, not in botanical texts or museum exhibitions, but in home goods, in little symbols of hospitality tucked into domestic design. Today, you'll find pineapples on welcome mats, door knockers, and hotel stationery. They've become shorthand for warmth, friendliness, an open door. And yet, they carry with them the faintest trace of their past. The empire, the glasshouses, The social wars waged over centerpiece positioning. It's all still there. If you squint hard enough, even in food, the pineapple has undergone its own quiet evolution. From rare treasure to cocktail garnish. From centerpiece to pizza topping, controversial, yes, but undeniably democratic. It's been pickled, candied, canned and blended. It has traveled not by ship under guard, but by barcode scanner at the supermarket. It's a fruit for everyone now. Which means, in a way, it's no longer a weapon. You sit in your own kitchen now, the hum of a refrigerator replacing the hiss of greenhouse steam. You peel a pineapple with a serrated knife that costs less than a corset ribbon. The scent is sharp, sweet, easy. You don't perform for anyone. You don't position it on a tray with silver tongs. You just eat it. The juice runs down your thumb. You lick it absent-mindedly. No scandal. No symbolism. Just flavor. This is how the pineapple ends, not with a fall, but a fade. A slow unthreading from the fabric of status and ceremony, until it becomes simply a thing that tastes good and looks fun in print. That might seem like a loss, but it isn't. It's a transformation, a liberation. The fruit that once meant power, class, empire, and anxiety now means welcome, sweetness, the sort of casual joy that doesn't require a pedestal. So you look around your own home. Maybe there's a pineapple-shaped candle. Maybe a kitschy magnet from a beach vacation. Maybe nothing at all. And that's okay. Because the pineapple is no longer watching you. It doesn't care if your linen is ironed or if your guests are impressed. It's finally free of performance. And so are you. The fruit sits on the counter now, sunlight warming its side. It doesn't glitter. It doesn't judge. It just waits, quiet, sweet, real. And now, as you let your breath slow, and the shape of the story softens into shadow, let's leave the pineapples where they belong, quietly nestled in old photographs, recipe cards, and the curious corners of antique shops. The drawing rooms have dimmed. The silver has tarnished just slightly. The footmen and florists have gone home. And in the empty space where once a fruit stood under candlelight, there is now only the echo of laughter, of gossip, of quiet panic, of gentle pride. Let your shoulders ease. Let your thoughts settle like dust on a parlor table that no longer hosts performances. Think of the women adjusting doilies with trembling hands, of the maids dabbing vinegar onto rind, of the men posturing beside fruits they couldn't identify if asked. Think of the warmth of that greenhouse, the mist, the frond that curled like a question mark over time. The pineapple is gone from the pedestal, but not from memory. It lingers like the taste of syrup on a silver spoon, or the crease in a letter. Folded too many times, you don't need it now. You've carried it long enough through 100 rooms, 100 years. Let it go. You're safe. You're quiet. You're home. The fan hums gently. The story ends not with a bang, but a breath. You did well. You made it through the golden fruit's long, spiny reign. Now close your eyes. End of script. Sweet dreams.